Hey friends, coming to you from our basement in our blue room. We call it our blue room because the paint on the walls is blue. Don't worry friends, Captain Obvious is still at the helm. Over the years, this room has kind of evolved from one thing to the next. When the boys were real little, they would play a lot in here, and now more recently it's kind of used as a guest room and even as a staging point for different projects that we have going on. As you can see, there's a lot of pictures around because as we're getting ready for graduation for Grant, we were kind of in sorting mode. As I'm going through these pictures, I'm coming across pictures of my family. Oh my gosh, here's my dad's parents on their wedding day and my mom's parents on their wedding day. Even a picture of my great-grandparents. Crazy. My mom and my aunt from when they were little girls, and even a baptismal picture. Great-grandma Agnes and great-grandpa Harry. And here's one of my favorite pictures. It's of my grandparents, Gigi and Papa, Dorothy and Win. My grandmother, Dorothy, told me lots of stories from her life. And as she would tell us these stories, they were ways to help her recognize all of the life that she lived. She had learned a lot over the years, and she wanted to pass on her experience to kind of help us in our journey. One story that she would tell over and over again was when her family lived through the Great Depression. She was a little girl, and she talked about that there was a really hot time one summer, lasted for quite a while, but she and her brothers and a lot of the kids in the neighborhood would sleep on the porch, just hoping that sometime through the night a little breeze would break the swelter that seemed to go on and on and on. During the day, the kids tried to keep themselves busy, and one time the kids got together and even fried an egg on the sidewalk, completely fried it. As she would tell these stories, you could just see her mind travel back over the years. She would tell them with so much emotion and just remembering. I often felt like I was standing right inside that little white house on Veracruz. As she would tell these stories, like I said, they were important for her to recall these parts of her life. It was important for her to tell them, and it was important for us to hear them. Even though they were hard times, those times of depression, it brought together her own family and her neighbors and her community. We're going through a tough time. We're going to have our own stories of how we survived the pandemic of 2020. So how will you remember these days? What will the stories be that you share? For me, I want to be able to share that I live these days by loving God and loving my neighbor. In Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, we hear that a Pharisee asked Jesus the question. He asked, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And Jesus responded to him by saying, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." Jesus says this is the greatest and first commandment. He says, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus concludes by saying, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Pastor Clayton Schmidt talks about this. He says, a key problem in interpreting this double commandment for our time is that we lose sight of the biblical meaning of love. Our culture has equated love with intense emotion. We say things like, we love chocolate, and we just can't help ourselves. We say things like, we love a movie, but in reality, it just entertained us. Biblical love is not a thing outside of ourselves that we can't just help but respond to as something almost passive. But biblical love is very active. In the Old Testament, there are all kinds of references to love, but this text that Matthew is referring to is based on Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. It's the love from Yahweh. Again, this love from Yahweh, God's love for us, is not passive. It is incredibly active. To love God with all of one's heart and with one's soul and with mind is to choose to respond to God as God has responded to us. And as we love our neighbor, these actions are marked by patience and generosity. In short, loving our neighbor is a conscious choice. So as you share the stories of this time, what will they be based on? Like I said, for me, I want to say that I moved through this time by living these commandments as best I could, by loving God and loving neighbor. I'm going to love God by studying his word even more and encouraging others to do the same. I'm going to practice loving my neighbor by encouraging them with a peaceful greeting, asking them how I can pray for them. If a neighbor responds in kind of a way that seems kind of sharp and ruffles my feathers, I want to exude grace and let them know, hey, this is a rough time for all of us. We have a choice in how we move through these days. How will you move through them? I encourage you to embrace loving God and loving neighbor. For when we do this, this is how we are blessed as our journey continues. Amen.